So we start. It is 10:30 sharp. It's 10:30? Yeah. So please come in, and Sonu, you may shut the door partially. So good morning and welcome to day 7 of our lecture series on geopolitics of Eurasia and the new great game in Central Asia. Glad to see you all, the regular and familiar faces. Some will join soon. Today's lecture is on Central Asian states as players in regional geopolitics, and the tutorial will be on maintaining strategic autonomy and balanced external policy. So before the lecture begins, there is one announcement. Today we are going to collect your assignments after the tea break. Okay? So this lecture is going to be for an hour. After that, we have a short tea break, and then the tutorial begins. So all the best, dear friends. Over to you, Professor Shawal.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Is this working now?
This has to work.
Thank you very much, Professor Obadier. Dear colleague Asma, and the audience, students and colleagues present today. I'm going to slightly suggest something by way of a reshifting, suggesting to talk about the Central Asian states as players in the regional geopolitics and the strategic autonomy and balance policy in the tutorial time, and focusing for the lecture on the question of the significance of engaging certain countries and affiliates in the Shanghai process. So the syllabus can be put on the screen. And let me introduce the topic first before I cover it. I wrote a few words on the whiteboard there with smileys to suggest that indeed when we talk about the significance of engaging certain countries, we can look at such or such countries or other countries. And certainly, if I draw the attention to Iran and Turkey today, I could also draw attention to Turkmenistan, although it is probably too early, but sooner or later in this sort of lecture, someone could, after Turkmenistan has changed its foreign policy, mention Turkmenistan as indeed a key player, a key actor, a key territory to the new Asia. Incidentally, the fact that Turkmenistan has permanent neutrality recognized by the UN in 1995, to me is no impediment to becoming a dialogue partner in its own right. After all, Turkmenistan became a guest to the organization, but has attended summits since 2007 or so, so it's a long, long time. And if the issue is that Turkmenistan doesn't want to join military organizations because it is neutral, then it cannot join the CSTO, but it can join the SCO if the SCO is a economic cooperation organization, maybe a security organization, but not a military organization. So refusing to affiliate on account of the SCO being indirectly hard security and will be military organization is an interesting point of contention. The more military the SCO would be, the less Turkmenistan would be able to join. But the more economic or cooperative organization the SCO would be, the more Turkmenistan could change its policy. My my guess is that Turkmenistan's foreign policy is going to evolve, be it only after the Central Asian Forum formed in 2017, after the Samarkand meeting, which I have already covered. Point one of my introduction of today. Point two is to suggest that, of course, every affiliate has a significance. I'm not suggesting that two countries, rather than Turkey, have more significance or more equal than the other affiliates. And we could, again, but we won't today, go through the list of affiliates, observers, dialogue partners, and talk. I think that some countries, some affiliates, have not more significance, but a significance that we cannot underlook. They form, so to speak, a sort of core or a sort of opening to the Asia, to the new Asia, turning it through the process I call acceleration of scale, from a sub-regional to a regional and possibly to a pan-regional, maybe pan-continental dynamic. Already the new Asia, as I call it, has extended south to this region. East less so, because East is limited by the fact that China, Mongolia and Russia are already in it. And East is standing northwest to Belarus and west to the Mediterranean and so on. So point 3 of my introduction is to suggest again, why are these two countries, in my analysis, Iran and Turkey, particularly significant? Because they represent the interface with the West, the interface in terms of cartography, the interface in terms of regime dynamics, and the interface of the new Asia. If we go to the map briefly, and as geopolitical analysts, we should consider maps as our friends, not as our life partners, but they are not the end of the story, but they are still there. I drew attention yesterday, if we could zoom in on the Wuhan corridor again, a very minute portion of the territory, that's too much, which holds the significance of the direct interface and the direct contact point between China and Afghanistan, and that corridor very much symbolizing today the potential dynamic of the region. If we move now to very briefly to the other point of interest, which is the Sino-Russian border between Mongolia and Kazakhstan, which is further up north. Asma?
Yes, sir.
Yes, there. No. There. Where's the pointer? Can I have the pointer again? It's a very much underlooked here. Here, this point. Can you zoom in on this zone here, please?
Yeah.
Yes, here. It's only 40 kilometers, and it's the only remaining border between China and Russia west of Mongolia. And this point is extremely sensitive. Could have known a different fate in 1991. It didn't. But this is the key to, it's too late now, but one day Mongolia's unlocking. It's a symbolic and strategic point, which is in terms of geomorphology, it's a very high mountainous point of the Altai range. So similarly, now if we could zoom back and show somehow Central Asia plus Iran and Turkey, so that we see the connecting nature of the territories, yes. So cartography suggests that when we look at the new Asia as this sort of zone, and the outlays of East Africa, Mediterranean, and Europe, there are territories which I, acceptably to you, I think, call link territories, and Iran and Turkey are particularly relevant ones for a number of reasons we have time to go into. But Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan are also such territories which have an additional significance due to the linking capacity they have between the new Asia and the rest of the west of the continent. So I suggest to cover in 4 paragraphs 4 different types of angles that we could be suggesting as relevant to understand the relevance of Turkey and Iran in the new Asian dynamics. First of all, paragraph 1, they represent, and the terms are imperfect, but they are to be explained, isolated or floating affiliates to the new process of New Asia. Paragraph 1 is based on political analysis, paragraph 2 on cultural analysis, paragraph 3 on economic analysis, and paragraph 4 on diplomatic concerns. So paragraph 1 suggests that these two countries have a particular meaning in terms of politics, in terms of domestic politics, and in terms of the perception of their politics elsewhere. Iran, I made it clear in this course already, goes through a period of isolation between 1979 and 2005 when it becomes observer to the organization. But we ought to focus briefly on 1979 and its significance. 1979 is not just a political event or an event that concerns domestic politics of Iran. It is a major rupture. It is a major rupture. It is a date that symbolizes definitely a fundamental evolution in the world power structure, a major structure which contains the whole meaning of post-neo-colonial relations, that between a regime, the Pahlavi regime, and the Western allies. and that magnitude of things, the magnitude of the symbol and of the reality, is that Iran then became, already in the 1980s, and particularly in the 90s, because it's the end of the Cold War, but also because the Iranian and Iraqi open conflict comes to an end, it has somehow embodied or represented the views of the new Asia in the making, the views in the making of the new Asia in the making, vis-à-vis the West and vis-à-vis the allies of the West. The stances of Iran vis-à-vis the West, vis-à-vis Israel, vis-à-vis a number of actors embody or contain the shift, the shift of perceptions and the shift of political discourses on the scale of the world, marking the 20th century, post-colonial, post-Soviet, post-Cold War times and the new times to come. I've said that already Iran and some of its presidents, not all of them, somehow say out aloud what the New East thinks vis-à-vis the West, and this is very much so. And very early on, I keep mentioning the 2005 SCO summit in Astana, but we should also remember the last Shanghai 5 meeting in Dushanbe in the year 2000, where already such views, which I call very imperfectly not anti-West, but vis-à-vis the West views, were clearly aired by Iran. Turkey, in paragraph 1, should be mentioned as a floating, not isolated, but floating actor in between three directions: Europe, the Middle East, or the Arab part of the world, and Asia. Turkey is a paradox. Turkey is a paradox because a number of dates are dates of pre-accession to the European Community. 63 is the Ankara Treaty of Association to the European Community. 81 is the mistake made by integrating Greece and North Turkey on the part of the EU. 88, 93 are the establishment of a free trade area or customs area confirmed in 93. 95 and 2002 are dates which echo again applications or diplomatic moves towards Europe. And so the history of Turkey-Europe since 63 is the history of delayed accession or delayed membership, which is now too late. So in that sense, Turkey is a symbol of European closing in my view, and therefore, or thereby, a symbol of the new Asia opening up. There is an incoherence in the European policy vis-à-vis of Turkey, which has become the EU criterianized, as I've said many times, and those criteria, certainly the economic ones, having been met by Turkey, and the political ones having been for many years on the way to being met, and then having become more complicated from the point of view of Europe after the early 2000s. So the paradox is made even more clear given that this 63 date is earlier than all enlargements of the EU, 72 and so on, all the way until 2007. And each time the enlargement took place, Turkey was quote-unquote missed out, whereas it was, technically speaking, in the process of being associated and considered as a candidate to the European construction. Turkey is a very modern industrial producer and market exporter and producer of products that are needed in Europe. And the same could be said in terms of economic potential of Iran. The difference, of course, is the issue of oil and energy. Second paragraph, a delicate one called a cultural approach. Those two countries being Muslim, Islamic, non-Western, a number of terms could be used by way of cultural approach. What interests me here is not so much the domestic characteristics of these issues than the perceptions of those two countries through cultural dimensions elsewhere. Iran is undergoing, after 79, an Islamic Shiite revolution and is perceived as such as a Islamic state in the West, and in a sense not the only but the most visible form of Islamic revolution in the whole area. The other examples being years later the events in Algeria in the 1990s, and in the same decade the events in Tajikistan, which for some reason are sometimes considered an Islamic revolution attempted in Tajikistan, whereas most analyses point to the fact that the so-called civil war in Tajikistan was caused by economic imbalance factors between economic communities in the country, as often is the case. But Iran then symbolized not only an Islamic revolution taking place in the country, but to some extent, limited extent it turned out to be, a revolution that could be exported. And in that sense, perhaps some analysts would suggest it was exported to Tajikistan, but not elsewhere. So there is, in fact, much less relevance of the religious factor, I think, in the interaction between Iran and Asia and the West, than relevance of a cultural factor, which is typically, as I called it earlier, a post-neocolonial positioning of the country. And I think post-colonial or post-neocolonial dynamics, however the words are not welcome, are a relevant way of analyzing the shifting or the cyclical nature of world international relations, and the transition from the 20th century to the 21st century, which is a gradual revolution. A number of days are relevant. Today we take it for granted, especially the young students. They were born after all these changes, so to them the world is organized as it is today. But it wasn't the case 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 50, 60 years ago. It was organized differently in terms of structure and international relations, formal ones, but also in terms of perceptions and intercultural and cultural shifts. Still in paragraph 2, Turkey now. Turkey has undergone an evolution which, to some extent, is also a cultural, would be a religious one over the past 20 or 25 years. Through elections, parties have come into power, into the majority, which echoed views based on a reversal, to some extent, of the secular nature of the Turkish Republic as established in 1923. So progressively, traditional values have come back, and issues of Islamic entering politics has been present in Turkey, which is a very specific situation. The Turkish Republic is definitely created in 2013 in 1923 as a secular one. And it is a very very important prism through which to understand the nature of Turkish politics, to the extent that the so-called Council for National Security, which gives the military a specific prominence, is perceived sometimes as a risk of the military nature of the regime, which is a complete mistake. It's the role given by the Constitution to the military in 1923 is a role to guarantee secularism, to guarantee the neutrality of the state vis-à-vis religion, a concept which we in France understand very well after the 1904 law of separation of church and the state, which is sometimes not easily understood elsewhere. So Turkey has represented, in my analysis, similarly to Iran, differently of course in details, but similarly to Iran, a shift in the positioning, affirmation of the country, able to be this or that, to be secular, to be a member of NATO, to be in many ways Europeanized in its aspirations, but also capable of speaking in its own right, establishing its own, so to speak, all-around comprehensive autonomy, and that then was materialized in the very significant 2012 status of a dialogue partner to the SCO, and Turkey's role in a number of organizations, either joined by Turkey, such as the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, or founded by Turkey, unsuccessfully in 1991-1992, the great market of the Black Sea and of Central Asia, and successfully in the organization of Turkish-speaking countries, Turkic countries more recently. So I come to the end of paragraph 2, and with these two paragraphs, 1 and 2, we have, so to speak, a classic form of analysis or a reminder of classic indicators, factors, or criteria of understanding the significance or the specificity of these two countries and the significance for the New Asia, because I repeat, they represent beyond certain national or specific characteristics. They represent the confirmation of a shifting cultural and political stance in the new world of the 21st century. More contemporary assets or criteria can be looked at in paragraphs 3 and 4. And before I cover them, before I conclude the chapter, I would like the discussion later on to focus on the fact that other countries could be similarly dissected by me in this topic today. And we can mention some of them and go through the 1, 2, 3, 4 factors, making them relevant to my analysis. I mentioned Turkmenistan, but we could cover some other countries. So paragraph 3, focusing from the economic point of view, and I feel the worst sitting next to you, on the territory or territorial reality, the energy reality as well, and what I call the economics of energy trade. I don't know if this is clear in the, yes, it is on the whiteboard, on the screen. Now, the two territories of the countries, Iran and Turkey, are, I think, extremely interesting and relevant and stimulating for us. Cartography suggests that they are the linked territories between the New Asia and the West. Cartography confirms that they are opening up to the maritimity of the Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, the Sea of Oman, and the Indian Ocean, and the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. So cartography tells us a lot about what they are. These territories are relevant in terms of energy production and or energy transport, and they are, in that sense, quote-unquote, ideal territories. And of course, energy transport leads to the economic role and to the macroeconomic advantage these two countries have. Iran first. Iran is the ideal of ideal territories because it is a territory and a space which is both a producer of energy, oil in particular, and gas. The production is taking place either south of the Caspian Sea or near the south of the country. So it's ideally placed because it can then export fairly easily this energy to outside markets. The distance between the south of the Caspian Sea and the open seas is more or less 1,000 kilometers, not very long. The terrain is not as difficult as it could be. Major oil producer of the world at that, of course, producer of the world at that, of course, but it is one of the key locations and offering also a point of view, although not the producer. As far as I understand, Turkey has oil reserves, but located underneath the Anatolian plateau, which is very thick and very hard to drill through. So it is mainly a transit territory in that sense from Asia to Europe, or from Asia to the Mediterranean in general. So the relevance of Turkey is basically symbolized and embodied by the BTC pipeline, the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, which we could maybe focus on the map. Could you focus on to show where Ceyhan is? Yes. I don't know if yes. Now if you move to the right, Ceyhan is somewhere there. Sorry, if you know all this, tell me. If you're familiar, I don't need to spend time. You should move to the right if you can. Display more of Turkey. No, move to the left if you wish. Yes. Yeah, that's it. Ceyhan is here somewhere. I don't know if you can. If it shows, if you zoom in, Baku, Tbilisi, so Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey here to the coast, and in the east of the Mediterranean, which is incidentally not such a stable part of the Mediterranean. But that pipeline, which actually came into operation 20 years ago, give a few years, is not just a symbol. It is the reality of the capacity to export energy from Azerbaijan to the Mediterranean and to Europe and to the rest of that part of the world, bypassing the other alternative route, which would be from Azerbaijan, either through the Caspian Sea to Russia or through well, it's Russia, but it's Chechnya, so it's a bit more difficult, also to Russia and so on. So the BTC pipeline is the alternative to exporting energy from Azerbaijan to the west, alternative to the Russian territory. And it is the only access to the Mediterranean, the Turkish territory, unless, of course, one day other countries such as Syria and others become partners or members of the SCO. Additionally, as similarly to Iran, Turkey is a non-Arab partner to the west in the Asian space. To some extent, these nuances between Persian, Arab, and Ottoman actors is relevant, not to the full extent, but to some extent. And to finish off on this point, interestingly enough, when the BTC pipeline was built and financed, there was a difficulty to obtain European financing, which is to me a paradox because the benefits of accessing Azeri oil is a huge one for the Europeans. And it is at that time, 20 years ago, the USA which financed more and which actually tried to push the Europeans to partake in the financing of the construction of the BTC pipeline, which I think the EU should have, whether it's a mistake or not. I consider it a mistake, or something which had been done more readily, more voluntarily. I think, and if it had been done more readily, more voluntarily on the part of the Europeans, it could have been an asset to the European legacy of to the impact of the EU in the region. So those two territories, to conclude on paragraph 3, make sense to a large extent due to their very location. You could argue that location is a given of history, not something that one works on. But similarly, from the strict point of view of economics and energy transport, again, the stake of securing those two countries, therefore those two territories as allies or partners or economic partners is absolutely clear. And so when we come to real geopolitics, the territorial and material factors, irrespective of, to a large extent, of politics and cultural and religion and so on, we see that efficient diplomacy would be one that secures those two territories in a organization or a union or a entity of cooperation. And to date, this has been the case of the new Asia that has secured those two territories by making one member, Iran, and by making another one a partner very early on, 2012, I repeat. Now, the last paragraph is also a bit delicate regarding the diplomatic analysis. These are two affiliates in the Middle East region, which is a complex one, non-Arabs, by which I mean that they offer a more diversified approach even by the new Asia. And in the meantime, of course, a large number of Arab countries have become dialogue partners of the organization. We looked at them some days ago. We can go to the list again if you wish. This means that by introduction to paragraph 4, we should remind ourselves that these two countries have joined very early on the organization of the Islamic Conference, formed in 1969 and renamed Organization for Islamic Cooperation in 2011 with 57 members, or 56 if you count only the UN members. Pakistan is in it, but not a UN-recognized state yet. So this amounts to the fact that these countries are, from the point of view of this organization, fully and very early on part of, with the other countries, of a common entity, which we could suggest to analyze, but we don't have time today for that, as a pan-Islamic dynamics, which are a current of analysis within geopolitics. So they are part of the Islamic Conference, whatever the name has become today, and not part of the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is in many, many ways the Gulf Cooperation Council, of course, in political, diplomatic forum, but a forum bringing together oil-producing and oil-exporting countries of the Gulf. So from the point of view of diplomacy, we shift the focus slightly to a number of simple facts, which I think are relevant to understand today how these two countries have, in my view, I repeat, shifted lastingly to new dynamics compared to the past. And in the conclusion of the course on Friday, I'll try to make clear again the relevance of the time factor. When something takes place, when an event, when a change takes place, we ought to spend a little time on making clear how long is the past period before the event takes place, and the longer that period is, my hypothesis is, the longer the coherence of the situation after the date of the change takes place will be. So the shifting of alliances which took place in the last few decades is a lasting one, in my view. It's not likely to be reversed again in a few years' time. No one can say about the long term. So looking at, from the diplomatic point of view at Iran and Turkey suggests the following very simple but I think relevant points. Iran can be or should be or is analyzed and looked at in terms of sanctions in many, many ways. And the issue is, more specifically, whether or not Iran is under UN sanctions, and it was for some time, it's no longer the case, so to speak, or whether it is under sanctions by one state, the USA in particular, or it could be some other state. Because the sanction regime of Iran is directly linked, as I've said before, I will say it again, to the eligibility of the country to the New Asia and to the Shanghai Organization in particular. So long as the country was under UN sanctions, it could not be accepted as a candidate to the Shanghai Organization. And that was the case until 2015. Therefore, that was the case, and that made Iran ineligible in the early 2010s. As I said to you, Iran was a candidate immediately after observer status in 2006 and so on, and it was turned down on many occasions. The official reason was that the SCO didn't have a procedure for considering candidacies, but the implicit or explicit other reason was that it was under sanctions. When it stopped being under sanction in 2015, it became eligible and eventually became a member in 2021. This relevance of the sanction regime is valid still today for Iran or other countries, and would be, I suppose, used to turn down or to delay a country from becoming a member, at least for some time. But what is interesting from this point of view is that Iran, after becoming a member, was not questioned as a member, even though it came a few years before becoming a member under sanctions again by the USA. And the sanction regime by the USA vis-à-vis Iran is still in place. It's fairly strict and fairly stringent, but that is no longer, so to speak, as relevant as before vis-à-vis the membership or the affiliation to the SCO. In plain English, what I'm saying is that, technically speaking, there could have been reasons to question the membership of Iran after it came again under sanctions under sections. That was not the case. And I think for two reasons. Technically speaking, because once a country is a member, it can be put under sanctions by a third party, but not, so to speak, qualifying as losing membership. To lose membership is possible, but only if a member does not respect the commitments within the organization. That's not the case. It's an external factor, and also because more delicately, I think, more difficult to make clear, because the impact of sanctions or the taking into consideration of sanctions is less strong today from the point of view of the SCO. So the Iranian case, from the point of view of the new field of SCO diplomacy, is, I think, a very, very rich one that that mobilizes a number of reshuffling of priorities on the part of certain countries. Interestingly enough, the year when Russia declared in favor of Iranian membership is 2015, the very same year as the year of the comprehensive joint comprehensive agreements regarding Iran and a number of Western countries. Turkey is also a very interesting actor to be looked at in terms of diplomacy, with very simple facts and dates that we can remind ourselves of. Because 2012 marks not only the moment when Turkey becomes a dialogue partner to the SCO, but it marks also the year when the Turkish-Israeli cooperation comes to an end in many, many ways. The two countries signed in 1996 a treaty of military cooperation, which lasted 1996 to 2012, that's, if I'm not mistaken, 16 years. 16 years of military cooperation, not a defense treaty, not a common defense treaty, but a treaty of military cooperation is a very meaningful thing for two countries, one within the Muslim world, not Arab world, but a Muslim world, and the other one being in a state of tension with the Arab world, and by extension defining itself as a religious state, by extension possibly with other states on account of their religion. So 16 years of cooperation between NATO and Israel, I think, is a very meaningful period and diplomatic reality. The reason why they went into this cooperation we could look at if you wish in the question time, but we don't want to spend time on that now. So 2012 is meaningful for two reasons, and I repeat: becoming a dialogue partner, the only one to date which is a member of a alternative military dynamic, which is NATO, and also breaking up the cooperation with Israel as a relevant actor in that region and an ally of the USA, and so on. So this brings into perspective a number of things. Again, my hypothesis, which may be wrong, is that Turkey's veering of priorities, Turkey's shifting of alliances or partnerships and so on, is a lasting one. That suggests that for a number of diplomatic reasons, not domestic political reasons, but diplomatic reasons, Turkey is looking east, as the phrase goes, past Israel, past Europe, past NATO not yet, but potentially, and becoming a partner, an affiliate, and one day perhaps an observer or perhaps a full member of a new dynamic, which I keep calling the Shanghai dynamic. And if you don't like the expression, you can call it the New Asia's geopolitical restructuring in the post-Cold War, in the in the shifting North-South dialogue. I mean, we can change the names. We can change the names, but it doesn't change the reality. After all, we can call our girlfriends and boyfriends different things, but they are basically boyfriends and girlfriends. So partners, allies, members can be called different things. If names are perceived with difficulty, we change the names. But it doesn't change the reality of the reshifting of the geopolitics of the continent. So that brings me, regarding Turkey, to some concluding words. I think Turkey, similarly to Iran, is a very rich example which which symbolizes or contains or embodies a number of alternative directions which have been explored. From the point of view of Turkey, there have been 3 phases in Turkish diplomacy, and 2 of them have not proven conducive to lasting preference, and the third has become, I think, the lasting preference. The first phase is the European direction. Turkey has explored the European direction in all possible ways for a number of decades, starting in the late 50s, and of course the symbolic date of 1963, which is the Ankara Treaty. And I repeat, it is a treaty of association. And in the technical European community vocabulary, association is a preliminary step to membership. It is the moment, which can last for long, of updating and adaptation of a number of parliamentary laws or a number of parliamentary decisions to join what is called the acquis communautaire in French, which means I don't know what the expression is in English, the body of European community norms and agreements. So each country should somehow adapt the existing European norms and requirements to its own national system before becoming a member. So it's a transition, it's a technical transition. But politically, diplomatically, historically, since the 60s, there was a clear European path for Turkey. Then came in the decade of the 1980s and to some extent 90s, an Arab direction where Turkey explored partnerships and concluded partnerships, including mainly economic ones, with the Arab world, sending a number of workers, welcoming workers, and exchanging trade in all possible ways, until that proved a direction which, for macro-financial reasons, was not viable and was then interrupted. And since the 1990s, clearly, Turkey has been looking to Asia and west to Asia, and we should not underlook the steps taken. One step, I repeat, is the suggestion to form, what was it called? The Great Market of the Black Sea and Central Asia. I think it was called like this. So the Great Market of the Black Sea and the Caucasian and Central Asia, bringing all the Turkic-speaking countries into some form of common market. That was the ambition. It failed for a number of reasons, not only because the Turkish president died, Mr. Özal, but because the then Central Asian partners were not macroeconomically and macrofinancially capable of securing the stability and success of a common market. Then Turkey formed or tried to form a number of entities using the pan-Turkic factor, the linguistic factor in many, many ways. And that is today still a reality. There is an Organization for Turkic Cooperation, which, broadly speaking, brings together the Turkic-speaking countries, which are much more than the Turkish-speaking countries, bringing together all the Central Asian states, linguistically perhaps with the exception of Tajikistan, and certainly Azerbaijan and others. So the expression to looking east has been used for other countries. I think India has had a look east policy. Australia, a long time ago, adopted a look into Asia policy. So these grand sort of slogans or phrases are, of course, shortcuts, but definitely looking east is the characteristic of Turkey today. So to conclude on these points of today, I repeat what I said at the very beginning. Focusing on 2 countries is a way for me to go into some details, 4 paragraphs, a number of dates and facts that I've reminded us of, but we could be looking at other countries, and we will, I hope, in this session today, to suggest for these 2 countries the concept of a link territory, which is not as often used as for Mongolia and others, is, I think, very relevant. They are link territories. The expression for them is different because they were never landlocked. Mongolia is and was, and so Mongolia's geopolitics is that turns the country from landlock to land link. That's the phrase which is fashionable there. but we could call them something else, and we could call them two extra things, so to speak. The first additional terminology that I would suggest is to call them new frontiers. New frontiers. I use in the introduction the concept of the interface between the New Asia and the West. There are also new frontiers. The word in American English suggests not a line, which is the French word frontière, which means in English border is a line. But the new frontier in American English means the potential direction, the open direction in which to push a development, or to push a conquest, or to push the realization or the formation of the new nation. So new frontiers, I think, is a term that could be used for these two countries and potentially for others. But if they are new frontiers, they are the new frontiers of the New Asia, pushing, not in an aggressive way, but pushing in an economic and macroeconomic way, the New Asia's assets to the West. And my second and last point of the conclusion would be indeed, in that sense, which other countries could be, in that sense, new assets or new frontiers of the New Asia. I mentioned Turkmenistan. I mentioned again Afghanistan, and in the recent years, some countries such as Iraq and Syria were mentioned also as new contemplatable new frontiers. This has changed to possibly Saudi Arabia and Egypt as the new frontiers. But whatever the countries, the concept is the thing that I want to underline. The fact that there is, beyond the establishment of a, formally speaking, already established entity, an organization with 10 members, the SCO, there are potential windows, openings, directions, frontiers. And focus on the keywords that are mentioned in the topic and the tutorial on your syllabus. The words players, the word region, the word autonomy, and the word balance. I think these are the four key words. And what do we make of these four words in the aftermath of my presentation before the tea break? I think one starting point would be to spend a little time on the four words themselves. The word player is there, of course, because we are mentioning the great game in the main title, but in fact, instead of players, we should say actors, newcomers, determining actors, or categories of actors. These are all actors. And when we say actors in a new dynamic, we mean in a way which is very delicate and sensitive and a bit touchy, in some cases, renewed sovereignty. The concept of sovereignty for all nations has meant at some point an extremely emotional, an extremely historical shift from the past to the present. It can be at different times in history. For Central Asia, definitely this is the early 90s. And interestingly, for you to know, in these countries, the words sovereignty and the word republic and the word independence and the word secularism are almost synonyms. They are part of a new identity which is epitomized in the new adjective form, which is adding an I at the end of the country, Kazakhstani, Tajikistani, and so on. So there is a great difference between Kazakh and Kazakhstani in the present time. But independence, sovereignty, republic, and in fact you find many more times the main square in the city called the Square of the Republic than the Square of the Independence. Whereas in other parts of the world it's a different thing. For us, sovereignty has been a specific thing from the early 18th century, 19th century, and then later on stabilized as a republic in the 20th century. The word region, of course, is a word that is an easy one and not so easy to define. There is my now famous definition of a region, of a modern international region that you saw on the whiteboard in the past. What is a region? To what extent a region is indeed assembly or a get-together of neighbor partners is the whole discussion and the whole point of my course before you this week and last week. My claim is that the SCO Asia is a region, which I'm sure you can dispute, you can comment as grossly imperfect, but there is something by way of Central Asian countries and SCO members forming what my definition suggests, as you know, that you've seen on the whiteboard. Now, autonomy and balance, that is a dialectic. How much autonomy should an actor want and retain, or for that extent, perpetual or permanent neutrality, keeping out of things, and balance in joining the dynamic to some extent. And I think these are the key words which I wish to emphasize more than players and region. And we talked about Turkmenistan at the beginning. I think Turkmenistan is a good example of that. The word autonomy means something extremely grand and strict and committed for Turkmenistan, permanent neutrality, which means keeping out or not being able to join whatever dynamics, and yet a balance. Turkmenistan, on account of its location, on account of its necessary evolutive diplomacy, cannot keep out. It has to be in to some extent. And I think the very symbolic fact that it is a guest to the SCO summit out and stepping one toe or half a foot in the door. And symbolically speaking, I'm right, because the category of guests and guest attendance was created for organizations, for the UN, for ASEAN, and for the CIS, and not for countries. It was extended, it was stretched to one country, paying lip service to the outsider, Turkmenistan. And as I said at the beginning of this class today, there is no, to me, technical reason why Turkmenistan could not become a dialogue partner, even an observer to the organization. A member is something else, because a member commits a country to a certain number of joint actions, including military exercises, including cross-investment, economic things, and so on. So autonomy and balance, I think we could keep these two words in our discussion and mention other countries. I can mention some other countries, or you can, or you should, or you must, and see whether they can be discussed in terms of their autonomy and balance. That's the first sort of major point I wanted to make. My second major point is going back to my presentation of today and my 4 paragraphs. I suggested to look at political, cultural, economic, and diplomatic dimensions. Political, I suggested to look at them briefly in terms of the domestic politics, but mostly in terms of the political dimension, which I'm happy to define more. The cultural dimension I mentioned without mentioning the word values, and I think the word values, provided we are, as Max Weber would have said, neutral in an axiological way, the economic dimension and the diplomatic dimension are the 4 ones. And I think the 4 taken together, political, cultural, economic, and diplomacy, point to one direction, that if the 4 are present, or almost all 4, then we are into a comprehensive approach of 3 things: the meaning for a country of the Shanghai dynamic, the relevance of a country for the Shanghai dynamic, and perhaps which is the same thing in fact, the synthesis, the mutual benefits or the mutual interaction, not the interaction and the reinforcement of a multilateral dynamic through its individual participants. That's using my 4 paragraphs and suggesting that they are the relevant ones, or the relevant 4 points: politics, culture, economic, and diplomacy, to focus on a number of countries. What is missing from this list? Is a cartography and the location of countries and states, which to me is never the dominant factor, because as we saw on the map, and we can go to the map.
The Wi-Fi connection.
Okay. The map is in your mind. So when we go back to your mind and to the map, we can see how certain territories obviously are relevant and obviously should be already part of the dynamic and are not, because other factors, some of these 4 factors, take over the simple cartography. Turkmenistan, Afghanistan are such territories that we should mention. We can look at other territories in the Middle East. That's for this part of the continent. For the northeast of this continent, of course, North Korea is a territory that makes no sense as isolated from the point of view of geoeconomics. It makes sense as isolated from the point of view of classic geopolitics or ideology or regime dynamics or legacy of unresolved external factor, which is 1950-53, which is often called the Korean War, which I never call the Korean War. I call it the Cold War in Korea, which makes a difference, or the Cold War in Vietnam, or the after war in Germany, and so on. So now we can open the discussion with your questions on the first part of today's session, of course, or, that is my preference, discussing countries as potential affiliates to the organization. And I'm more than happy, if my colleague is still in the room, now I think she's left, to have disagreements or questionings of my views. This visit has made me very much aware, Professor Opadier, of the fact that I came with the idea that Central Asia at large was a concept that was, if not sufficient, at least relevant to understanding the continent, and I'm becoming aware that I'm lacking many South Asian views which should be added.
Wi-Fi is not connected.
That's why I like papers and whiteboards and my own voice and so on. The technique is. So, ladies and gentlemen, and authors of essays, today is when you hand in your essays and when I read them, with great pleasure. Any questions, views?
Any questions, comments, views? Please start. Somebody can take the lead? Yeah, please. Sir, do you think there's any relation between...
Sorry.
Sir, do you think that there's any relation between Arab Spring and the coming of Turkey into the SCO, like the improved relations of Central Asian States with Turkey?
Thank you very much, because I forgot the Arab Spring. It's in my notes somewhere there, and I forgot about it. There is no causal or determining relation, I don't think, but there is a contextual.
4 questions.
That one was something that was in the air for a long time already. So Turkey's decision to go east, so to speak, is based much more on diplomatic realism than on the impact of domestic regimes.
On the part of Central Asian States? What she's wanting to know, did the Arab Spring trigger the decision of Turkey to be a part?
No, my short answer is no.
No.
So on the part of Central Asian states, for example, like I think Uzbekistan started taking more democratic approach after 2011, and then it was also visible in the foreign policy. Like Uzbekistan started taking more divergent foreign policies, and then Turkey becoming part of SCO. So then improved relations between Central Asian states and Turkey.
Well, to prolong your question, first of all, the concept of a spring, meaning a popular protest or challenge to the regime in place, took place only in Kyrgyzstan, and half a decade before. It took place in Kyrgyzstan in February 2005, which is, in terms of chronology, way before, and led to Kyrgyzstan definitely experiencing alternations, changes of majorities in parliaments and presidents and so on, but not to instability of the kind experienced in the so-called Arab Spring countries. So I see, between a connection and not connection, I see more reasons to say no connection. But the contextual analysis, the one I've mentioned to you many times before, is one in which some link or some indirect influence can be searched for between certain events and other events. So certainly what the Arab Springs in that sense means is that it is possible for a nation to challenge its leadership. And that as a concept has since then existed even in Central Asian countries, but not with the effect that they were able to actually impact directly the regime, which has been, on the contrary, in all those countries, with the partial exception of Kyrgyzstan, continuing as such. They were more, the public opinion was more voiceful. The presence of candidates in elections was more real. The existence of alternative parties to the majority party also became real, but not challenging the regime in place. The domestic evolution you suggest for Uzbekistan can be suggested to have taken place later on. The change you suggest for Uzbekistan before 2016 is not, I don't think, so real. What do you mean by your comment on Uzbekistan?
Sir, I was asking maybe there's any impact of these states were not as per se democratic. So maybe there's any impact of Arab Spring on the Uzbekistan foreign policy, like more divergent views.
Well, the impact of a domestic situation on the foreign policy, this is something else, and even more indirectly to be clarified. I think it would. I cannot answer more than to say there is. The short answer is there is no direct connection between the two. I don't think. The foreign policy of Uzbekistan has changed. This is true for a number of reasons, partly to do with the situation within the country, but not as a consequence of the Arab Spring. The major shifts, the relevant dates for Uzbekistan, roughly speaking, is that you have a first phase which goes from the early 90s to 2005, so almost 15 years, which is a long time, of a foreign policy, how to call it, clearly open to the West, clearly open to partnerships, alliances, or at least trade partnerships with the West. This changes in 2005, following the sanctions imposed on Uzbekistan by the EU and others following the Andijan situation. So a foreign policy that veered towards Russia to some extent, or towards the security aspect of the New Asia to a large extent. Then 2012, when Uzbekistan opposed the change of the CSTO treaty, and I wasn't clear enough when I mentioned this a few days ago, what happened is that the suggestion was made by Russia to change the treaty to the effect that the decision within the CSTO to open and deploy Russian military bases in partner countries would be taken by majority decision, no longer by unanimity decision, which de facto took away the right of veto from members, especially Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan opposed that change in the treaty, and it was not successful to stop the change of the treaty. Therefore, it left the CSTO, 2012. Since then, Uzbekistan has been on a sort of in-between position, not so much vis-à-vis the West, and not so much open to the West as before 2005, and not so much not aligned, but not so much close to Russia as between 2005 and 2012. Since then, what has happened is that there's been a change of president in Uzbekistan, which clearly also impacted the foreign policy of the country in the direction of improving, normalizing, enhancing relations with the neighbors. So relations between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan have improved, markedly so vis-à-vis Kyrgyzstan, with which there was serious cross-border water issues, and relations with Kazakhstan, which had been at some point not very good, due to a number of factors, one of them being a leadership rivalry between the two presidents, Karimov and Nazarbayev. You know, men and women have their psychology and their personal factors of of leadership competition based on their history, based on their age, based on their gender, maybe, I don't know. But so that's so a lot has changed, but the connection between the Arab Spring and Central Asia, I don't see as relevant. I'm thinking because in causal relation to it is the fact that the SCO's diplomacies in general has opened very much to Arab countries. If you look at the list of new observers, let's just count how many of them are from the Arab world, if I may suggest to call it that. Starting from 2021, which is the acceleration of the affiliation of dialogue partners. Egypt, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, that's 4, Maldives, United Arab Emirates, that's 5, Bahrain, that's 6. So 6, more than half, new affiliates are Arab countries, which is a new opening in terms of diversification, cultural diversification, if you wish. The main meaning, of course, is the accession to maritime spaces. As I've said before, that's much more relevant to me than culture or religion or anything else. But the truth of the matter is that until those years, there was a reality. I'm not saying it's a reluctance, but there was a reality where a few Arab countries were affiliated, and not many Muslim countries outside the near abroad zone from the point of view of Russia, the concept of near abroad, so on. So your question, to conclude, I'm sorry I'm a bit long, but this is a very motivating question. To conclude, my answer is that there has been clearly a more comprehensive approach to enlargement or affiliating over the past 5 years than in the past. That the concept of criteria for considering new affiliates or new members are become very loose. There are, in fact, no such criteria as such. If you think in terms of the European criteria, which are political, based on democracy, whatever the word means, and based on macroeconomic indicators, Maastricht indicators of growth, public debt, and so on. Thank you for your question. But your question is good because it is an intellectual question. It is an academic question. What is academic analysis? It's an analysis that seeks to expose a cause-consequence relation. Causality, that's all what we do, from Monday to Friday. Thank you, Madame.
Hello, sir.
Hello.
Sir, there is an issue of debt trap with regard to BRI closure of China. And
The debt trap.
debt trap.
Debt trap, yes.
And Russia has history of intervention in Georgia and currently Ukraine. So how Central Asian states will trust China for economic development and Russia for security?
So these are two different issues. The debt trap as a possible negative aspect of the BRI, that's one thing, and the intervention in other countries is another. So one is more difficult than the other to answer. I think the debt trap, that's for an economist to actually explain more, is a reality of aggressive economic investment or trading policies, and any actor pursues its own interest. That's what the realists tell us. And China is legitimate in offering, but there is no such thing as a free BRI. Offering is one thing, facilitating is another, and sharing the cost is, of course, part of it. Now, the negative story is that of Sri Lanka, as you know, where over-debt led to a partial de-sovereignization of a territory. And that is a dynamic which has made other participants of the BRI very much aware of the danger, which is why, to some extent, you'll find that the infrastructural development, railways in particular, west of China, and the best example is into Kazakhstan, because that's the longest border. What's the name of the city which is at the border between China and Kazakhstan? Kyrgyz, I think, or a name like this. Can someone check? Kyrgyz, yes. anyway, no one wants to help me, so that's fine. Fine is a situation where, on the Chinese side, the railways are fully developed and modernized and ready to connect, but on the Kazakh side, they are less. They exist, but they are outdated. And one reason, not the only one, but one reason is that the cost of such development is such that if Kazakhstan were to readily subscribe to Chinese finances, they could risk falling into the debt trap. So this is a factor which very realistically appeared as a danger or as a trap for a short while, concerned a few countries that made the other countries very much aware of the risk. So that's one answer. The other question is more difficult because it would call for more knowledge than I have. All I can say is that if you use the word intervention, which has a very specific connoted meaning in Soviet history, and also in the Soviet-Chinese relations, it is a term that refers to behaviors of the past. I think in today's world, intervening is old-fashioned. It does take place in a way which is anachronic, and being anachronic, which will probably lead to a reversal of the consequences of the interventions. And so that's all I can say. It doesn't mean that in the present world warfare is not still in fashion, but it's a different type of warfare. Financial, trading, intellectual, communication warfare. The issue of what is it called? Providers of internet. I mean, who controls the connectivity of communication? That has become a very active form of warfare, so to speak. If war is defined as an aggressive behavior, considering zero-sum gains still as an option. Sorry for not answering fully your question, but I lack the competence and knowledge.
In point 2, you mentioned one of the common points between them is Muslims and Islamic and non-Western. So, sir, if we see this like 90 to 95% of Iran is Shia dominated, and about 4% of Turkey is Shia dominated. And in recent times, we have seen how the president of Turkey is trying to revive the Orthodox Islamic traditions there. Like, for example, establishing a mosque by overthrowing a earlier church. So, sir, how do you think religion can play a role between these two countries? Will it be a point of convergence or divergence?
Again, a delicate question, but to which I have more answers because I've thought about this for many, many years. First of all, I think that when we use the word religion, we should distinguish between two things. One not being relevant to the discussion, and the other being relevant to the discussion. What is not relevant is religion in the sense of the faith, the beliefs, the rapport to God, and the faithful's prayers and so on. This is part of what we call in France the private sphere, or it's part of the family. And in fact, most religions suggest that the praying should be something done by the individual, not secretly but discreetly, and not done necessarily in common. The other aspect which is relevant is the mobilizing capacity of religions, and that has characterized the past centuries to some extent. The Crusades is one form of such mobilization. The Inquisition in Spain is another form of mobilization, which has concerned all religions, Christianity and Islam and all religions. So that's relevant, but in a limited manner. It's relevant in the sense that it can be used as part of a number of political factors to mobilize communities, groups, nations into such or such geopolitical attitude. But the main determinants of geopolitics are, I repeat again, as I'm aware of it, territorial and material. It is only in the name of territorial conquest or expansions or extensions of protectionism and in the name of access to resources, or access to maritimity, or access to trade routes, that nations interact in a fierce manner. That's my short my short answer to you. The other part of my answer is that I did use the three terms on purpose. You listened to me very carefully. I'm very flattered. Either Muslim or Islamic or non-Western. My point is to admit as much as I can the cultural aspects of international relations. There is such a thing in geopolitics as the analysis of panisms, and something, pan-Turkism, pan-Arabism, so on and so on. These are movements which are a cross-border, regional, pan-regional instances of mobilization based on shared values, or shared identities, or shared perceptions of selves, not on religions. Pan-Turkism, or pan-Arabism, or pan-Thaism, or pan-Germanism are not based on religions. They are based on nationalist factors or cultural factors, to be more exact, sometimes pointing to languages, sometimes pointing to traditions, sometimes pointing to ways of living, but not on religion as such. So why do I use these terms? Not to shy away from my responsibilities as an academic to mention certain realities, but Muslim, Islamic, non-Western, I think non-Western is more appropriate because it refers to the fact that there is, in history, shifts in the power cycle where certain regions dominated others in the name of what they were. Sometimes in the name of religion, but not in the spiritual sense, in the political sense of the religion. And also non-Western or Western or pro-Western or anti-Western or pro-Asian are very generic terms. Within Western, you can put a number of things that you want to and we could open a discussion on what the East means or the West means and the South and North. And my starting point, if we did open a discussion, would be that these terms have changed their meaning. In fact, in French, we have two words for West, which exist in English, but one is not very much used. We have West or Western and Occident. L'Occident, which as a word you understand, but which is not used so much in English. And so my last point would be to say that when we mix languages, it's a moment that should be given attention to. How in other languages are these terms called? How do you say in Hindi, in Urdu, in Tamil, in Arabic, in Chinese, West, East, Western, Eastern, so on and so on. These are always words that reveal a way of thinking or reveal a perception of the reality. In the history of thought in East Asia, these terms are not so much used. The term used by the Chinese and the Mongols are all under one same sun, as the Chinese say, or all under the blue sky of Tigris, as the Mongolians say. So it's not West or East. It's the idea of being central, which is a bit different. In the Korean history, there was a moment when they opened up to the West, became aware of the West and its scientific traditions very late. That was only in the 19th century. So then they devised the concept of Donghak, which means Western science, or Western scholar, or Western scholarly tradition, which was first made illegal. It was forbidden by law to read books written by Western scientists in medicine, in chemistry, in physics, even, let alone other from sciences. So these terms, in fact, we should teach a whole course. I'm hinting to my colleague that we should teach another course on just these terms. What do we mean by East, West, Asia, North, South, Europe, Africa? Terms we use all the time on a daily basis and that we rarely take the time to define, and which we should. So back to your question. You underlined my paragraph 2. Thank you very much. And then you said?
So, will religion be a point of divergence or convergence?
Okay. So my answer is that religion is much less relevant than many other factors to be considered. And however difficult it might be for you to accept the fact that Europe is diverse on the factor of religion, yet it is. And definitely, I can say more if you wish, but definitely Asia is diverse on the factor of religion. That is not preventing Asia from being constructed. In terms of religions, today's member states group how many religions? 4 or 5 at least, main ones. I mean, main ones in quantitative terms. So religion is not a factor, and I would go so far as to suggest that it never was a factor. Even if you go back to centuries and thousands of years of power politics in the world, religion has been at times mobilized. Some religions were forbidden, some were kept as allowed in the practice of the individuals. And there are some scholars who argue that the most stable empires were those where religions were kept and different practices allowed. This is said of the Roman Empire and also of the Mongolian Empire, except one was very short-lived and the other was much longer-lived. And the same is said of empires being more stable if they respect all religions, languages, and even a degree of local administrative and legal autonomy in parallel to the main imperial legal system. So the Roman law was imposed, but to some extent local legal systems were maintained as well. So religion I tend to downplay as a factor of relevance.
Sir, thank you very much for your enlightening lecture.
Thank you for your daily compliments.
My first question is whether the policy of neutrality of Afghanistan, whether it is also, my main intention of asking this question because in your concept of New Asia, whether this policy of neutrality is also having some kind of impact within this SCO framework. Is having some kind of effect, or it is creating a kind of imbalance within the Central Asian republics because they are fully cooperating?
Clearly, it has an impact in the sense that the country has not yet been willing or considered as a partner and observer and so on. But my intuition, or my hypothesis, to call it a more academic term, is that things will change and evolve. The recent examples of neutrality being changed to participation in military organization is that of, unless I'm wrong, Finland and Sweden recently, whereas Swedish and Finnish neutrality, ever since I was their age, so it was considered as permanent, or so things change. The other answer is that I would go so far as to suggest, and I need to find the right metaphor or analogy, which might be a botanical one. There have been evolutions in the position of Turkmenistan as a country and positions in the acts of the other neighbors in their own policy. And I go back to the November 2017 forum in Samarkand. I will explain more what I mean. I think because the Turkmenistan's territory is an indispensable link territory, because Turkmenistan, for good or bad reasons, is part of the so-called 5 countries Central Asia, which I'm a little bit critical of, or not critical, who am I to be critical? Am I hesitant to accept at face value? And due to the fact that Turkmenistan has such a key role to play in energy economics, all these regions point to the fact that the situation will evolve. Whether it might take a change of leader and of president, maybe, or a change in the context of the region, or sufficient, acceptable, not pressure, but persuasion being exercised by the neighbors on Turkmenistan. Whatever way it will take, things will evolve. The botanical metaphor that I've just come up with is the fact that if you take a seed and you put the seed in the soil and you water it, it will grow. If you then restrain the growth by a glass jar or something, the growth will be less easy, but eventually the growth will be such that the plant will become fully alive. So my joking answer is always to say to students, imagine yourself president of a country. What would you do in the short term, in the middle term? And what the country does, or a president, or a parliament, or a majority, or a party, is balance out the benefits and costs. So the benefits, the positive aspects, and the negative aspects. In the early 90s, Turkmenistan, and I was planning to go through each country of the region and to characterize it, but we can do it with Turkmenistan. The country chose as a post-Soviet course of action to be neutral and to remain out of multilateralism. So it was shortly part of the CIS, then it left, if I'm not mistaken. It was shortly part of some organizations and then left, contending with being part of the UN, that is for its sovereignty. And I don't think, can we check whether Turkmenistan, how many organizations is Turkmenistan, no internet, is part of, but none or very, very few. And that was the course of action chosen. Other actions, other courses were chosen, whether to remain extremely close in their positions to Russia or to become more open to the West, as mentioned before. So different positions were taken. They're all perfectly, as we say in French, noble or acceptable, but they are different, but they are probably bound to evolve. Look at Europe. One country, for mixed reasons, was kept out of the European community for many, many years, Britain, partly because Britain hesitated a lot to joining the organization. Perhaps similarly, India hesitated. Also, we had a French president, General de Gaulle, who left power in '69, and the next day, 3 years later, the next day, Britain was part of the EU. So, and we've had countries which were long hesitant to join, suddenly joined. Also, things change. Positions change.
So my second question is, I was just reading articles few months back when through the border settlement, Pakistan actually has surrendered some of its territory to China. So, it's my personal opinion. I don't know whether it is academically true or not, but whether in this kind of scenario, the small states like Tajikistan or Pakistan, those who are economically not well off, so they are becoming submissive to SCO.
Two or three answers to your question before we take the lady's question. Border settlements were something which were worked on and reached from the early 90s and formalized in the late 90s. And most of the agreements, border agreements, date back to 2002, 3, 4, 5, that sort of time period, except for some which remained contentious, especially between China and Tajikistan. And Kyrgyzstan too, actually, and they were settled later on, and some of them very recently. Usually in a way which gained a few square kilometers to China. But if you look at the border settlements over the last 30 years, most of them have meant that extra square kilometers went to China, so to speak, at the expense of the negotiating countries, in the name of peace or good relations that could foster economic interests and so on. Why is it different? Does it seem to be different from Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan? Because they are smaller countries. If you look at the figures, and I encourage you to do so, if you look at the real figures, how many square kilometers were transferred from Kazakhstan to China? I think many more. But the percentage of those square kilometers for Kazakhstan's territory is, of course, very much smaller. Kazakhstan is 2.5 million square kilometers, unless I'm wrong. Yes, I think it is 5 times France. And so, but for Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, they are smaller countries, so the issues is much more relevant. Also, those two countries are mountainous, and therefore, with square kilometers comes hydro resources and potential hydroelectric resources. So it makes things more touchy. For Kyrgyzstan, there is a specific sensitivity to sovereignty. The country is more politically active. You have, majorities come and go in parliament and in government. So the political debate is more vivid. And so the opposition is often very critical of the majority in government for having yielded to China. But when the alternation comes and the opposition becomes the majority, they also are critical of the decisions that have been taken. For Tajikistan, you call it a poorer country. I think the proper term would be a more dependent country. It's a country that is dependent on macroeconomic terms on key partners. Let us remind ourselves that almost half of the GNP of Tajikistan, certainly 40+%, come from remittances sent by migrant workers who worked in Russia mainly and also in Kazakhstan. So the dependency rate is extremely high. And one way to ease out that dependency on Russia, essentially, is to also use Chinese subsidies or factors or investments. So for that reason, the country is, how to put it,
Not only decisive,
ready to accept a number of territorial concessions. But the concessions that are taking place now are really minimal ones compared to the situation of the early 90s. I'm not a historian, I'm not an expert on the history of, for 2 centuries almost, the territorial gains of Russia and even of the USSR at the expense of China. This has happened all over the world. I mean, all over the world, someone at some point took some territories. But the extent to which there was a case for tabling those issues and solving those issues after the USSR was dissolved was a real one. And so much real that I've said to you before, and this is often not taken into consideration, the willingness or the necessity and the acceptance to table border issues was manifested by China in the early 80s and eventually led to some meetings that have taken place in the late 1980s after Gorbachev assumed power. And there were attempts to table these issues which were unsuccessful, but which paves the way for the post-1991 very rapid capacity to negotiate those borders. So what you are suggesting is happening today is more than relevant, but in terms of broad historical perspective, what do you call it, one of the few points sort of left over, which are not minimal, but they are towards the end of the list of points to be resolved. And there is a lot to be studied about the way these negotiations happened, but we don't have time for that now, but how China and the other 4 neighbor countries, as one bloc, negotiated one-to-one, so to speak, because all the archives necessary for that were in Moscow. So the Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Tajiks were dependent on the former Soviet and then Russian archives. And then negotiations took place on a one-to-one basis, China, Russia, China, and so on. And this happened fairly easily and quickly, whereas diplomats are always reluctant to act quickly. Yet on that occasion they did. Madam.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
It's a small question. It's related with SEO and how the global South countries view about SEO. So it's been viewed that Beijing is building momentum for an increasingly comprehensive vision of a new global governance system with China at the center. So basically, I want to ask, your views about this, and is it going to create stewardness, basically, in the global South? And if so, then what can be the way out in order to keep the vision or the objectives of the SEO intact?
So two answers. I think, first of all, the concept of governance, if by governance we mean formalized and to some extent rigid institutions, at the heart of which there would be one country, that is not a likely scenario, in the sense that governance in that sense points to the direction of integration and I said to you before, the concept here that I use is cooperation. Cooperation doesn't need rigid, established, to some extent, sovereign government. So I don't believe in that sense in the scenario whereby a one country-based governance will be established. My concept is juxta sovereignty, or not the paradox, but the fact in my definition that you have at the same time reinforcement of sovereignties and invention of multilateral capacity to devise common programs. That is one answer. The other, so my first answer goes against what you are suggesting. My second answer goes along with what you are suggesting that some countries, China or others, definitely is embarked upon an activist, comprehensive, all directional effort to launch with others dynamics which rest on a factor such as economic, a factor which is strong in that country. So China is pursuing the development of trading organizations, economic organizations, because China is strong in the economic field. But there is one that we haven't mentioned yet, very much, called, what is it called? The Comprehensive Economic Regional Partnership. What is the exact name? Comprehensive Economic Regional Partnership, which includes a large number of countries, I think about 20 or 15, of which China is a key player, not India, but it was discussed whether India should be a part of it when it was first suggested. So you have that, you have the BRICS, you have the SCO, you have the New Silk Roads, you have a number of programs, all of which correspond to China's interests, not exclusively, but logically, countries want to be strong and active in the field where they are strong. If you look at the European history, it's different because we're different. But the key actors in the European construction were actors which history made prominent in political terms, in the leadership of Europe. I sometimes oversimplify the construction of Europe by saying what happened in the 50s with 6 countries. It is the merging of common sense between 3 countries that have played a key role in the military and political fate of history, France, Germany, and Italy, for good reasons or bad reasons, whatever, in the century before, more or less, and 3 countries, small countries, which invented the concept of community. The Benelux countries invented, in my view, the concept of a community, innovating from that preceded the concept of entente, the Baltic Entente and the Balkanic Entente, and the community with an interesting reality. The Benelux is sometimes understudied. They invented not common currency, but fixed currency exchange rates. They overnight decided that the Belgian, Dutch, and Luxembourg currencies were on a fixed parity thing, thereby stabilizing the exchanges, which at their scale was a huge step. So they invented the concept of community, which was taken on board by the other 3, and the 6 of them together meant that the new Europe was invented in the 50s. Missing from it, of course, other key players of Europe. Europe cannot be fully realized without England or Britain, because the history of Europe is partly that. Poland, Spain, they came in later, but they had to come in and of course East Europe, and in my view, Turkey, but it's a lost cause. I wrote a text which was called, what is it called? The logical necessity, I think, to associate and integrate Turkey into the European construction from the point of view of geopolitics. And I stick to my point. Anyway, there was a hand raised, I think, behind.
Thank you so much, sir, for the insightful sessions you've been giving. My question was like, over the past 5 years, the Caspian Sea, Dead Sea, and the Mediterranean Sea and the Gulf regions have been the flashpoints for the conflicts that have disrupted the regional stability and the global interests. So you mentioned the roles of the Iran and Turkey in energy transportation. So my question was like, how can Iran and Turkey strategically engage in Central Asia's energy and trade dynamics to create a framework for regional economic interdependence? This is the first question. And the second
Okay, let's take the first question first. So how can Iran and Turkey realistically or with credibility engage in a trading construction in the region? Well, very easily so. I mean, I've underlined the factors of complementarity, territorial, of course, mainly geopolitical at the same time, and even cultural, not in the sense of religion, but in the sense of shared values. Clearly, Iran and Turkey today share more values with the New Asia than they do with the West. And the West, we should find some alternative terms. Let's call it Western Eurasia, which is a term that I used 20 years ago, and which was at the time not used so much, not because I was, visionary, but because the term Europe is connoted to the West in the 20th century sense. But in terms of shared values, Iran is looking east, Turkey is looking east as alternative to other directions. And both countries looked very hard in other directions. Iran looked very hard at the Gulf space. Iran applied at least twice, maybe 3 times, to the Gulf Cooperation Council, was turned down. Turkey applied to the European Union on many occasions. So they really looked hard for alternative directions. And Asia proved the one that was more open in the context of the post-Cold War in the 21st century. So these two countries obviously play a key role. And of course, the difference is between ideal, typical academic analysis on the one hand, and realized, practical, concrete political realizations on the other hand is real. It may take years or long years before the two come together, but the trend is there. I see clearly for countries such as Iran and Turkey, even Turkmenistan we just discussed, the fact that they are already or will become, let me find the right word, partners to the new dynamic, which we call energetic or energy transportation or trading issues. But this is why more and more we need economists to join our research, because they can tell us what the macroeconomic reality is, what the public finance reality is, such things as productivity, currency reserves, economic policies. They are now becoming more relevant to understanding what is happening, because the other factors, which are classically diplomatic, political, military, so on, are now not less important, but they are clarified. Whereas the economic dimension is.
So given the persistent conflicts.
Sorry.
So given the persistent conflicts in these critical waterways, can their collaboration offer the viable solutions to stabilize trade routes and reshape the geopolitical landscape of the Gulf and the broader Middle East?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So do you want me to come in for
Yeah, trade routes, you mean in the logistical sense or in the diplomatic sense?
Sir, I'm saying given the persistent conflicts in these critical waterways, they have been having...
Which waterways?
Sir, they have been having recent conflicts in the last 5 years in the Red Sea, and all of them are having major waterways issues. So in that case, can their collaboration offer the viable solutions to stabilize the trade routes and reshape the geopolitical landscape of the Gulf and the broader Middle East Asia? Broader Middle East.
Yeah, the short answer is yes, in the sense that I would use again the term diversification. Some waterways are unstable or blocked. Alternative waterways are explored, and I think there is a case for suggesting that the New Asia's dynamic is one that could be summarized, excessively so perhaps, but still to some extent, by the maritimization of continental Asia. Those countries are characterized, at least China, Russia, and Central Asia, by a very specific connection to maritime geopolitics in their history. The 500 years of Russian geopolitics is essentially summarized by one priority: access to the seas. Yes, from the great Duchy of Muscovy or Moscovia in the 6th century, expanding to the Baltic Sea, to the Caspian Sea, Black Sea, and so on. So this has meant that the most powerful, the most relevant actor as a continental actor, Russia, is also characterized by maritime geopolitics to a large extent, which to me explains also some of the recent developments. China, irrespective of its coastlines, has recently become a maritime actor. In geopolitics, when we say continental or terrestrial land on the one hand, or maritime on the other hand, we do not mean the size of the territory or access to the sea. We mean the use of the territory with success or not, and the use of maritimity for power construction. So when a country has land or has access to the sea, and secondly, attempts to use that geographical characteristic as the basis of its power, then we can talk about a land or a maritime actor. So China has recently turned itself into a maritime actor. Recently meaning half a century, whether it's the 80s in terms of exporting capacities and opening of free zones in its ports and all that, or whether it's the naval equivalent, reinforcing its navy and so on, is discussion. So these have turned into, well, for Russia, Russia has remained and China has become maritime actors. Central Asian states have been landlocked for so long that we forgot they were in any way connectable or by the maritimity. But part of the present geopolitics is to turn them into linked territories and connect them to the maritime spaces. And it's not very far. If you go through Turkmenistan and, well, they have the Caspian Sea, two of them. And then from Turkmenistan to Iran and so on, you have access to the sea. So there is this, looking for the right word, this prism or this indicator to be used, or this factor to be used, access to maritimity. So back to your question, there are troubled waterways, as you call them, but there is an attempt to diversify. When something is blocked, something else opens up as a possibility. Not only for those countries. If you look at the USA, clearly the USA has redirected its energy import routes from the Red Sea and the Mediterranean to the route that goes around the continent of Africa. And as a consequence of that, not as a cause, as a consequence, the super tankers used by the USA today are too big to fit into the Suez Canal. So the change of the route is not caused by the size of the ships. The size of the ship is the consequence of the fact that now they are going around Africa, and so they can use larger, more profitable tonnage of oil exported. So similarly, for the countries you are mentioning, we are mentioning, there will be alternative waterways. The Red Sea and the Suez Canal is obviously bypassed if access is through the Mediterranean, and of course the Indian Ocean. And there are alternative ways now looked at through the North Pole, the new routes that are opened. And in October, one student presented a topic on the Indian-Russian maritime routes, which was very inspiring. So diversification alternatives is my answer. Good afternoon.
Sir, actually, my question is regarding today's imperial topic. So, the Central Asia have many neighbors. One of them thinks like it's their own backyard. There is China, which is investing billions of dollars in as a infrastructure kind of thing in this Central Asia. Then there is a USA, which is interested in this region due to its location and its resources. Then there is a Iran, which is interested due to the religious kind of thing. Then there is a Turkey, which is...
Religious kind of thing, we need to be more specific, but okay.
Then there is a Turkey which wants to form a pan-Turkic world from Turkey to Xinjiang. So do you think that in the background of this situation, can Central Asia have its, maintain its own external balance policy or its own strategic autonomy in this point of the time?
The short answer is yes. I think in many, many ways Central Asian countries have been able to maintain or create or maintain from dominated or centripetally dominated by the neighbors. The neighboring neighbors, China and Russia, and the projected neighbors, the USA or the EU or some countries of the Middle East. And all of these actors are sometimes referred to as providers, dominant providers, or welcome or not so much welcome providers of either security, in the words of my colleague in Tashkent, Farhad Tolipov, or providers of investment, or providers of other forms of development aid. All these other countries or organizations opened offices in Central Asia. The Japanese and South Koreans opened the equivalent of whatever it's called, Korean Overseas Investment. Anyway, I forgot the exact names. The USA did as well. The EU did as the EU, meaning a multilateral event. The Saudi Arabia did also, and Turkey. Yeah. For the anecdote, when I first traveled in these regions, I realized that most hotels were in fact owned by the Turks. I mean, there were a massive tourism investment by Turkey in that region. So, of course, there were attempts by the neighbors and other countries to move in. Humanity is what it is. Whenever something opens and is not a vacuum, but is in need of investment or a presence, there are people who are prepared to offer that investment or presence. So they all did. But have these countries become dependent, in the sense of excessively dependent on the countries you mentioned for their hard security or investment, so on? I don't think so. There's been a degree of balance and diversification to a large extent. Some needs have been met by their own multilateral dynamics. The CSTO offered post-Soviet military cooperation on the plaza, so it was there. The SCO is offering a security organization, economic cooperation, facilitations, and so on. Some needs have been met by bilateral relations established by each of these countries with other partners. Uzbekistan, despite becoming a member of the SCO in 2001, for many, many years looked to the West, to the Europeans and to the Americans for investments. So they have been able to balance out to a large degree. I would suggest that the capacity to maintain a balance is much more than the partial reality of being dependent. But of course, one is always dependent on neighbors. That is not de facto a problem. It depends how dependent. So economists, again, can look at the figures and tell us what is the figure. What is the percentage of Kazakhstan foreign trade or GNP realization with China? And it's in the region of, I don't know, let's say 10% maybe. What is the share of Chinese trade with Kazakhstan in terms of China's total foreign trade and GNP? It's 0.00 something. So it's imbalanced in that sense. Yes, of course it is, but not imbalance at the risk of a trap or excessive dependency. And this is true, I think, but we don't have time to go really into the full detail. That would be a good PhD topic, by the way, just in any case. But for Kazakhstan, clearly, Kazakhstan's diplomacy has been able to be with China and Russia in a capacity to sort of balance out some dynamics. On the one hand, from the point of view of Kazakhstan, establishing good relations with China to balance out the risk of dependency on Russia. That's one factor. Second factor is being a sort of go-between, a mediator between the two countries as rivals in leadership, using a number of, even to some extent, sociological factors. Are you listening while you're talking to your neighbor? Yes. That's what I thought. Yes, please join in. Let me just finish this, and then you can join in. In the sense that, for reasons which some observers put forth, Nazarbayev is being being the very long-dating, long-lasting leader in Kazakhstan, being older than Putin, having some sort of natural authority, and also being in power before the present Chinese leadership was in place, and so being able to also act as a continuation factor, did result. Nazarbayev's personality and psychology was also able to play a role, not dominant one, but play a role in the Kazakhstan's capacity to be between those two countries. And recently, what's interesting is that one of the locks, it's difficult for you to understand, perhaps not easy for me also, but this Kazakhstan's, Uzbekistan's, let's call it leadership sort of competition, did block or slow down the capacity of the region to organize itself as a sub-region, but this is not superseded. So the short answer is that those countries were able to maintain balance more than engage in dependency. But this is the key question, and the next key question would be to what extent is membership of the SCO conducive to the balancing out of those countries? Formally, yes, because they are equals in the organization. Or is it to some extent, what's the expression, yielding to Sino-Russian dominance and being, as one of my Chinese colleagues called them, the lesser states in the SCO? The neighbor to that gentleman has something to say. Sir, your neighbor. Well, you talked to him when I was talking, so.
Actually, he was saying the Kazakhstan-China data, so it's $13.1 billion.
Right, yes.
Bilateral trade between Kazakhstan and China.
Okay, but what do the figures mean? Because trade is in both directions, so,
It is in favor of China. The balance.
No, of course it is, yes. Of course it is, but I, as a non-economist, would suggest to look at the figures year after year after year. What was the situation in 91, in 90, and so on? Things have picked up very quickly. Also because in the first years, the type of productions were complementary. The Central Asian countries in particular were producing fertilizers under the Soviet system that were needed in China. And China was providing electrical appliances or household appliances, which were severely lacking in Central Asia. So there was complementarity of trade, but things picked up very quickly. The same happened between South Korea and China, which went from 92 to 93, 94, from almost no bilateral trade to becoming each other's first partner or second partner, sort of in trade. So this is a clear and easy indicator of change for a political scientist, a more complex indicator for economists, because they have to find figures and confirm figures. Sorry, yes?
One last question? No? So, okay, we are done for today. Thank you so much.
Sorry for the Wi-Fi problem.
No,
So I've spoken to the person. He's saying he'll come tomorrow.
there is no ground on which you should be.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, this is a technique. It doesn't
Sorry
matter.
for this.
We can do without the technique. We have done for many years.
I'll try keeping some maps tomorrow.
Yes.